Hello.
Ah, Beppe, ciao.
Hi. Hi, Jack. How are you?
Not too bad.
Okay.
We're waiting for you to kick off.
Um, uh, 15 people are at meeting, and I think that we can just wait some 1 or 2 minutes in order to see if someone else is wanted to attend. Okay, it's 2:40, and if you agree, I can introduce the meeting. Okay. Good afternoon to everybody. Giuseppe Russo speaking. I'm the managing director of the Centro di Ricerca Luigi Einaudi. And every year, the Centro Einaudi wants to honor the memory of Professor Giorgio Rota, who disappeared in 1983. With a prize that with the Fondazione Cassa di Risparmio di Torino we organize and we give to some papers that that are prized after a call that every year have a different subject. This year we were we chose as subject of this prize the um, the the issue of the discussion of the main economic tendency in the contemporary world economy, because we believe that we are in a particular time where pandemic and the change of the technology and the changes in the economic models are combining and are giving us a world different from the globalized world that we discover in the past 20 years. And in every conference, we are grateful to the speech, to the opening speech of a distinguished lecturer, and I want to introduce in this section Jack Birner, professor at the University of Trento and now member of the scientific board of the Centro Einaudi, that will introduce the paper presentation with its opening speech. Jack, thank you for being with us, and it's your time.
Okay, thank you, Beppe. The title of my address is rather ambitious, and I felt a bit embarrassed when I was suggested this title. It was assigned to me by the organizers of this ceremony. And since, as Beppe just said, the Centro Einaudi had just conferred the big honor on me of becoming a member of the scientific committee, I did not have the courage to refuse or even to suggest a different title. So I'll try to make the most of my assignment. Now, I'm an economist, but I'm not specialized in making predictions. And even if I was, the track record of economists is perhaps, if we're lucky, in the same league as meteorologists. So why would you be interested in the ideas of yet another economist on what the main economic tendencies might be in the global economy today? The brief answer to the question about the main tendencies in the contemporary world economy would be the one the then governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, now Lord King, gave when he was put under pressure by politicians to predict what was going to happen after the financial crisis broke loose. He said, "I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball." And that would be the end of my address. Now, but since I've accepted to give this talk, I cannot completely dodge my assignment. So later, so as not to disappoint Beppe, I will mention some economic and related developments that I expect or hope will play an important role in the world. But most of what I have to say will consist of considerations about whether or not economics is equipped at all to foresee such tendencies. Now, to me, the word tendencies immediately conjures up the idea of trends. And I don't think that's only due to the fact that I'm a student of the philosophy of Karl Popper. And now that I've mentioned Popper, particularly in the context of the Centro Einaudi, it's only a small step to his longtime friend and comrade in arms in the battle against illiberalism and obscurantism, Friedrich von Hayek. Their friendship and mutual intellectual influence have not received the scholarly attention they deserve. And one of the objectives I hope to achieve today is to at least arouse your curiosity. Now, by yet another association of ideas, as you Italians so beautifully say, mentioning Hayek leads me to the following anecdote. In 2004, at the end of a conference in Siena that was organized by my friend Carlo Zappia, I told a left-wing British fellow economist that the closest that economics had come to conducting a controlled experiment was the United Kingdom under Margaret Thatcher. The UK is separated by the world by the sea, and Thatcher boasted that her policies were inspired or even dictated by the economic theories of Milton Friedman and Hayek. At the time, I meant this mostly as a joke. It was not a very good joke because my colleague was not amused. And now, almost 20 years later, when I think about it again, I have reasons to believe that perhaps there was more to my wisecrack than I could have suspected at the time. Let me explain. During the last 14 years, economists have had two major occasions of putting their ideas and theories to the test in a laboratory that consists of the entire world. Of course, I'm referring to the financial and economic crisis that started in 2007, and the other episode, the pandemic that we are still living through, which was principally a healthcare problem, but both its effects and the ways in which it was dealt with make it compulsory study for economists. What do these two episodes have in common? Now I'll use some slides. Let me see if we can find my presentation. Yes.
It's okay.
The list is not exhaustive. Do you see the PowerPoint slide?
Yes, we see.
What they have in common is an unprecedented scale of fiscal and regulatory government intervention in the economy, except perhaps for the two world wars. And one of the consequences of these interventions was a rapid and massive increase in public debt. And I see with pleasure that one of the prize-winning essays is dedicated to the Euro countries' sovereign debt crisis. That is a very important problem indeed. In both episodes, exponential developments played a central role, which may explain why people, ordinary citizens and politicians, were relatively slow to recognize that there were large-scale problems with very pervasive ramifications and consequences. In both cases, there is sufficient hindsight, which Moses Findley once said, that most important instrument of historians. But perhaps hindsight is a very important instrument for economists as well, to recognize that the problems could have been contained, might have been contained, had they been recognized and understood sooner. And once they got out of hand, they were very difficult to contain indeed. Even countries who initially seemed to be successful in containing the epidemic, later, in the second or third wave, had difficulties in keeping it under control. And in both emergencies, to conclude my list, my selection, the fate of individual human beings, enterprises, and country was intimately related to and dependent on that of all others. Neither of these emergencies had been predicted, not by economists nor by experts in public health. And by not predicted, I mean not only that the possibility of these emergencies had not been foreseen. After all, virologists and epidemiologists had warned about the possible recurrence of the likes of Ebola and swine fever. Economists, instead, with very few exceptions, had not even foreseen the possibility of a financial crisis. I don't know if you remember the Queen of England, when she was at the ceremony in 2008 at the London School of Economics, turned to the economists present and asked them, did nobody see it coming? And those poor economists, it took them weeks and weeks before they came up with the beginning of an answer. So by predictions, I mean predictions in the full, let's say, natural science sense of the word. Not only laws that are being applied, but predicting when and under what circumstances, what conditions, these events would have materialized. Now, what makes these emergencies very interesting for our topic today is that they have provoked interruptions of tendencies or trends that we had taken for granted. economic crisis interrupted a trend, a tendency to reduce government, sovereign debt. And even dramatically, the pandemic not even interrupted a trend that we had taken for granted, but even reversed it. If we look at Italy, in the less than last 2 years, the average life expectancy in Italy dropped from 83.2 to 82.3 years. So almost 10 months of life expectancy were reduced statistically by the pandemic. Now that puts an abrupt end to what we consider the most stable regularity that we know after the certainty that we will all die, demographic trends. Now perhaps these somewhat humiliating experiences ought to lead us to give up the pretense that we can always come up with real predictions like those in the natural sciences, and look for more modest and realistic alternatives instead. For that, I suggest we go back to the classic text on the philosophy, in the philosophy of social science, Popper's The Poverty of Historicism, which was published in 1957. The book contains a somewhat abbreviated version of 3 articles that he published in 1944 and 1945. Popper's main object of criticism is the belief in the existence of historical laws, which he calls historicism, the historicism of the title. That doesn't mean that he doesn't believe that trends exist. He says trends, or more precisely, the assumption of trends, is often a useful statistical device. But trends are not laws. The emphasis is Popper's. A statement asserting the existence of a trend is existential, not universal. And the statement asserting the existence of a trend at a certain time and place would be a singular historical statement, not a universal law. The practical significance of this logical situation is considerable. While we may base scientific predictions on laws, we cannot, as every cautious statistician knows, base them merely on the existence of trends. A trend, we may again take population growth as an example, which has persisted for hundreds or even thousands of years, may change within a decade or even more rapidly than that, as we discovered with the life expectancy in Italy. Now, why is stating the existence of a trend, which Popper calls a prophecy, not enough? That is because if it is falsified, we don't learn anything except that we were wrong in stating it. If, on the other hand, the prediction of a trend that is conditional, based on a theory, is falsified, we have at least an idea where we have to start looking for what is responsible for the falsification. By making predictions instead of prophecies, we may learn from our mistakes. In order to be scientific and practically useful, the study of past, present, and future events should allow us to learn from our mistakes. That is the crux of Popper's philosophy of science. Now, logically speaking, predictions and explanations are symmetrical. That doesn't mean that a failure to correctly predict an event such as the crisis or the pandemic and its economic consequences makes economics and virology or epidemiology incapable of explaining them. That is because in conditions of indeterminism or complexity, the logical symmetry between explanations and predictions does not carry over into a practical symmetry or symmetry in practice. We may be able to explain events after they have happened, even though it has not been possible to predict them. In other words, even if we know the relevant laws, we may not be able to ascertain or predict the presence of the pertinent initial conditions. The problem that partly coincides with the fact that in the social sciences the behavior of individuals is guided by what they think and expect. Hayek puts it like this. The truth is that in social evolution nothing is inevitable, but thinking makes it so. It's our ideas that determine social and collective developments and outcomes. Now, 55 years later, in the third volume of Law, Legislation and Liberty, Hayek writes that man is not and never will be the master of his fate. His very reason always progresses by leading him into the unknown and unforeseen, where he learns new things. Now, on the face of it, these two statements may seem to be in contradiction with one another. That conclusion, however, would be mistaken. That is because Hayek, like his friend Popper, emphasizes the fact that individual actions, including the policies of governments, almost always have consequences that not only are unintended, but often also unpredictable. Now here, Popper comes to the rescue or complements Hayek by observing that we cannot predict the content of future knowledge. For if we could, we would already have that future knowledge, which is absurd. So it's a reductio ad absurdum that Popper presents. This, for instance, is relevant for innovations, which is the topic of another prize-winning essay. The limited possibilities to produce scientific predictions for the social realm clashes with people's desires to dispose of reliable and possibly, preferably, certain knowledge about the future. Scientists are always under pressure from business and politics to provide certain predictions all the same. The pressure is hard to resist, particularly in these times in which university budgets keep being cut. Few academics have the moral courage or the financial independence to give the same reply that Mervyn King gave. This is an important and additional reason for teaching the limits to the possibility to predict the future, to predict to future social scientists, in addition to advanced statistical techniques and sophisticated forecasting methods, which are very important. Now, this makes it indispensable to undo a dismal development of the past. Most of the attendants may be too young to know, but when I studied economics, and when my fellow students studied different social sciences, almost all curricula made at least one course in formal logic and one course in the philosophy of science compulsory. Now, with the rationalization and abbreviation of the curricula, these subject matters have been cut, and I think that is not a very good development. They ought to be reintroduced into academic curricula. Now, here we encounter a problem that is perhaps even more fundamental. As we have rediscovered during the pandemic, scientific rationality is not the same as political rationality. And what politicians see fit, what they think should happen, does not always, or perhaps rarely, coincides with the advice that scientists give. That problem is not new. The relationship between a democratic government and the expertise that is required for solving economic and health problems have already been addressed by Plato and Socrates. And together with a friend of mine, Rob de Vries, I'm reading Plato's dialogues in these weeks. And it is surprising to see how relevant they are to the situation today. Time and again, we say to each other, it is as if you're reading about what is happening today. Both Popper and Hayek expose the link between obscurantism and authoritarianism on the one hand, and a pseudo-scientific approach to the realm of the social. This common engagement of theirs hides some important differences. They don't agree on some very fundamental problems. They hardly ever discuss these in public. After all, they wanted to combat these dismal, these dangerous movements. After all, they worked during the Second World War. But to the attentive reader of their work will see that the differences between them are very important indeed. They have different concepts of rationality. Very briefly, their intellectual ways part from David Hume. Now, the main elements of Hume's philosophy are empiricism, skepticism, conservatism, and the logical criticism of induction. Popper adopts Hume's critique of induction and his skepticism, or skeptical version of empiricism, and which means that observations serve not only to test and not to just serve to test theories and not to justify them. These are the cornerstones of Popper's critical rationalism. Hayek, on the other hand, adopts an observational variant of Humean empiricism that goes back to his early work in the philosophy of mind. He even boasts in the introduction to the Sensory Order, which contains his ideas on the philosophy of mind, which he wrote down when he was between 20 and 22 years old. He boasts that he has taken empirism to its logical consequences. And the second element that Hayek adopts from Hume is Hume's conservatism. Hayek thinks that individual human beings are irrational. Rationality, with a capital R, as Hayek writes somewhere, is a collective social phenomenon. It exists only at the level of the social. Most social institutions have spontaneously evolved to solve particular problems, and our limited human understanding can hardly, if ever, discover the mechanisms that make them successful. Now, from this, Hayek draws the conclusion that we had better not interfere with institutions because they, as he says, contain the wisdom of ages. This conservative conclusion is part and parcel of Hayek's liberalism. Popper, on the other hand, is convinced that individuals are capable of being rational. The rationality consists of critically examining and discussing our ideas and theories, by which he means that we try to falsify them. We try to put them to the empirical test. Together with his social democratic political philosophy and preferences, this leads Popper to a more optimistic idea. We can change the social world. But, he warns, we had better adopt a cautious approach. Instead of large-scale and comprehensive interventions, which he condemns as holistic or utopian, we should follow the approach of what Popper calls piecemeal engineering, changing a little thing at a time. By making limited changes to social reality, we reduce the risk that unintended consequences provoke major or irreversible damages or effects that may keep us from realizing our objectives. And in addition, of small changes, if possible one at a time, makes it more likely that we can trace the origins of the unintended consequences of our interventions to their causes. Now, you will say, this is not what we needed in the financial crisis and in the current pandemic. And what we needed and what were implemented were large-scale, massive interventions on a global scale. Does that make Popper's ideas obsolete? I don't think so. To say that the crisis is too precious to waste, which has been attributed to various people, is a good summary of what, according to Popper, is the main goal of science: learning from our mistakes, so that we may come up with better solutions to our problems in the future. And the third prize-winning essay addresses exactly this question: what can we learn from our experiences with the pandemic for the tourist sector? Now, there are various instruments and ways for making this possible, and piecemeal engineering is only one of them. Another is the creation of the conditions for controlled laboratory experiments. That may be through putting actual people in laboratory conditions and let them behave in a certain way, let them react to certain incentives and try to trace their reactions. But a even more recent approach are computer simulations, agent-based simulations, which have evolved into very powerful instruments that have become indispensable for conducting simulations. Now, when Popper wrote Poverty in the 1940s, he couldn't possibly have foreseen the role of computers. Nevertheless, in the third part of Poverty, he talks about simulations in all but name. He says there, comparing various possible trends amounts to saying, let's suppose the following 3 or whatever number of scenarios are compared, developments will take place during the coming 8 years. Stating the duration of central importance, given the use that is made of thinking in scenarios. How would we have to allocate the economic resources at the disposal of government in order to adapt to any of them? Of course, the allocation of resources is only one of the many questions one may examine with the help of simulations. Now, limiting ourselves to this example, thinking in scenarios may help to prevent committing resources irreversibly. It is a means for introducing prudence into policy. And this is only one possible application of simulations. Now, for reasons unknown to us, unfortunately, this passage did not make it into the book edition. I think if anyone were to reissue The Poverty of Historicism as a book, he would do well to include this passage too. Now, a next step would be to try and transform the world into a laboratory. Now, of course, we cannot do this literally. What we can do, and what is already happening, particularly during the pandemic, is to create the conditions for using the world as a laboratory. They include the making homogeneous and comparable of empirical data and the systematic collection of data, and creating the necessary institutions, such as the World Health Organization and the OECD. They already exist, or reinforce their role. Now, this is not unproblematic. We have seen from the discussions on the role of the WHO. They show once again that scientific and political rationality often pull in opposite directions, particularly on a world scale. So these organizations ought to be reinforced and defended. Now, despite what I've just told you, let me conclude by mentioning some economic tendencies that, in my personal and subjective opinion, I find threatening or dangerous, and some that give me hope. Now, look at the following list of the richest people in the world. The ranking has just been reversed. Since yesterday, it seems that Bernard Arnault has superseded Jeff Bezos. He is now worth $187 billion. Now, let's compare this wealth with the gross domestic product in billions of dollars with some countries. that puts the wealth of these people into perspective. Now, what does this illustrate? What does this indicate? This ranking and the order of magnitude of, well, these fortunes are an indication of the dramatic inequalities within and between countries that the market economy generates. This is a problem that particularly Piketty has brought to the fore. It's a very important problem, so I'll just mention it and leave it aside. What the list also indicates is the return of what almost everybody thought was a phenomenon of the past. This is not an original idea of mine. It was suggested to me by my friend Pietro Terma. It signals the return of centrally planned economies in a different form from the socialist systems, but with some of the same problems. These problems include a concentration of economic and political power and influence, and the perils to the freedom and property rights of the individual. Do we own the data that Amazon collects on us? Clearly not. Perhaps that ought to change because it has huge consequences. Not all the tendencies that I see, however, are negative. I see some developments that give me hope. One is that the cooperation by the major central banks of the world have reinforced the idea that a stable monetary system is a global public good. And since it requires investments and continuous maintenance on the part of participants, it is perhaps better to speak of a global common pool resource. And I can only express my hope that this perception will not succumb to the follies of influential politicians. The pandemic too has the potential of convincing politicians that health is a global public good or common pool good. If they succeed in translating this idea into practices that include the distribution of vaccines to all countries, regardless of whether they can afford them, this would be a miracle, a true miracle, that adds itself to the already sensational speed with which academic laboratories and private biopharmaceutical enterprises have developed, tested, and put on the market the vaccines, a range of vaccines. As a last possible tendency, let me add the hope that the economic crisis, but particularly the pandemic, has convinced academics of the necessity to adopt an interdisciplinary approach to the solution of the important problems of the world. Now, I see in the three prize-winning essays a signal of hope, because they do address important problems. That is a bit anomalous in current academia, because I have seen, to my alarm, that the incentive system for young researchers almost forces them to publish often highly technical and extremely admirable essays that are so specialized that their distance from solving problems in the real world is enormous. Now, whether that allows what Hegel calls the rules of reason, this incentive system, if that allows the rules of reason to survive, I don't know. In the end, it all depends on the fact that, as Hayek wrote and as we've just seen, in social evolution, nothing is inevitable, but thinking makes it so. Thank you.
Excuse me. Thank you, Jack, for your speech, and we appreciate a lot the way you introduce the argument of the limited power of our econometrics methods in delivering forecasts. and also in suggesting that probably a good policy should be based on prudence better than on trends, and also the fact that trends are not low is a key data that sometimes we miss in our speculation. And obviously, also in my university, I lack of a course on logic, and so I shall recover reading some book on this issue. I see that trends in the past year were really an issue, because we see the persistence on some economic behavior. I can remember that we see in the past 10 years the increase in the public and also in private debt without huge bankruptcies. And this is strange. And we have seen the increase in the money creation, huge money creation, without having inflation. And also, these are strange trends in terms of economic theory, and we experienced the case of policies that want to freeze and to stabilize this trend as natural. And also in the past, I think 40 or 50 years, we have seen the increasing financial yields in the financial market, and this yield has been always measured better, superior to the real growth in the economy. And this is also a strange trend. And in my the mystery that we are probably observe is that all these three relations are not laws; they are simply a trend. And if this relation in the future will break and will cease to exist, a dramatic crisis can appear and change our life. So we have to we know that I haven't any doubt that we with your speech gained a good lecture, and now we are more we will be more cautious in managing concept like trends, and I hope also the politicians will be more cautious. But it's time to go on with our ceremony, and so I want to introduce Mr. Bonprezzi, Pietro Bonprezzi, and Filippo Passerini, that I see both them here, and they have about 15 to 20 minutes to do their presentation of the paper that won the prize. And I please one of them to start, and we are happy to have you with us today.
Thank you, Professor Russo. The pleasure is mine also. So I'm presenting our paper. So I'm start sharing the screen. If you see it. Okay, perfect. So thank you for inviting us. It's really nice to present for Centro Einaudi, and hopefully one day we will meet in person. Hopefully it's not possible now, but however, it's still a pleasure. Today I'm presenting a paper me and Pietro are writing in the last month, called "The Rationality of Spillover in the European Union: Evidence from the Sovereign Debt Crisis." First of all, I want to present myself. I'm a second year PhD. I just started doing research in the Catholic University of Milan. Actually, this paper deals with time series and macro issues, while I'm a labor economist, but however, I'm still deepening this aspect. While Pietro is in Bicocca University, is a second year PhD as well, and is a macro guy. So let's start. Do you? Okay, so the European Union has been hit by several shocks in the last decades. The most relevant was the European debt crisis, which is the main focus of our analysis. And more recently, the COVID pandemic has hit very hard the economies of the European country, and we are still going through and trying to manage it. Basically, our proposal aims at shedding a light on these shocks and their effect on the yield curve in a sample of European countries. Rather than focusing on the standard research questions such as the effect of the growing debt, which characterize many countries in Europe, Italy primary, we will on growth, for example, or other macro variable, we will focus on what we call the interconnection between the yield curve in several countries. So the financial connection among the yield curves and volatility in European countries. And to do that, we rely on two novel financial econometric techniques, which have been only superficially exploited out of their field and to answer research questions in a different field. Basically, our findings are that not all countries in Europe are equally risky. Some countries share risk and influence other countries' yield curve, and some other absorb this spillover. Later, we will explain what these spillover are. And so there is a lot of heterogeneity also, let's say, beneath the surface in the financial interconnection in the European countries. We will also focus on decomposing the yield curve, focusing on Italy and Germany in order to understand at which changes, at which time frequencies, or better, time scale, most of the changes in the yield curve happens, in order to understand what's the kind of trust and what's the investment behavior, and whether they trust different countries, Germany and Italy, primary, in the long, short, or medium run. But before, let me take a step back. Me and Pietro started this work a few months ago, starting from the debt and sovereign debt literature, which is quite wide and definitely you know better than I do. And it's a literature that mostly aim at identifying, by relying on standard econometric approaches such as regression and the use of the instrumental variable, causal link between sovereign debt and growth or other macroeconomic condition, or vice versa. For many reasons, endogeneity and the fact that we cannot rely on microdata, which is the main field where, for example, endogeneity has been detected by relying on the instrumental variable. This kind of model and this kind of approach have mostly failed, and this has been pointed out in many works. The first one that came to my mind is the recent one written by Panizza and Presbitero, which widely discussed it. So we try to start from this issue, so focusing on the sovereign debt and trying to understand which are the effects. But rather than adopt the standard econometric techniques, we mutuate to techniques that are common in financial econometrics and has been not widely, only superficially explored outside of their field. Why we believe that they might be helpful in understand and answer some research questions. These techniques are the Diebold and Yilmaz algorithm and the Wavelet decomposition. So basically, we will focus on what we call the endogenous part in the sovereign disk. So rather than the effect that the sovereign debt has on macro variables such as GDP growth, rather what's the indirect effect that shocks in the yields and volatility curves of other countries have on the yield and volatility curves of a certain country. And we will compute this spillover among a sample of European countries. And trying to answer some questions such as, questions such as how much the countries in the Eurozone are linked regarding this spillover. Is there a sort of homogeneity in the direction and intensity of this spillover, or rather there are some countries that are risk spreader or risk absorber? And does this spillover are correlating somehow to the debt crisis? Does this spillover increase or reduce during the crisis? And then also, does this is correlated with the investment behavior in terms of different time preferences at which the yield curve moves, in order to understand which is the kind of trust investors have in different yield curves. Finally, our work is also related to a policy debate, which is the one regarding the structure of the European Union. COVID, as already says, highlighted the sovereign disk in Europe. And this requires a shock of that size, systematic and shared answer by all countries in Europe. The European Commission has already approved the next generation EU plan, and the policymaker in Europe and the economists have started also to discussing important step that hasn't already been taken, the one of the Aerobonds, so the emission of a jointly guaranteed financial instrument in order to push the European structure forward and do some steps. We believe that these steps must be taken, and but based on facts. And so European policymakers should acknowledge the existence of this spillover and how much countries in the Eurozone are interlinked and influence each other. So basically, this is a review of the literature we refer from, and I skip it. So methodology are two. The first one is the Diebold and Yilmaz spillover algorithm. Basically, I'm going really quick because it's mostly technical, this part. It applies forecast error variance decomposition on the yield curve. And then he basically tried to understand how this forecast error variance decomposition is influenced by shocks from other yield curve. And it does that for all the countries included in the sample, and it computes a sort of score. These scores are of three dimensions principally: the risk or the spillover that the country gives to the other, spillover that's received by all the other countries, and then the net spillover. So basically what we are interested in are the net spillover, because they basically compute whether a country influence each other more than it is influenced. In this case, we will observe a positive spillover, or the opposite, whether it is influenced by the other. And also we will compare the results pre and post the crisis in order to understand the time discontinuity. We rely on 5 years sovereign bond yields of 10 European countries. We rely on public available data because we couldn't rely on different sources. And we split the sample from 2006 to 2020 at the threshold of the start of 2009. Okay, so let's go to the first results. So basically, these are the net spillover for the sample of countries we considered in the pre-crisis period, say from 2006 to 2009. Basically, what we found is that these spillover are relevant. The algorithm computes relevant spillover, and the country that accounts for most of these spillover. So basically, the country that influenced the yield curve of other countries mostly are France, Italy, and Germany, which are obviously the most relevant country in the European zone, and also the countries that have the most relevant banking channel. So the underlying hypothesis we need to test. We haven't tested directly. Is that this spillover moves through the banking channel. And other countries such as Belgium, Netherlands, and Denmark, who has negative spillover along all the time span. So basically, we identify 2 clusters of countries, one influencing each other, and one cluster of country made by big systemic country that influence other yield curve, and a cluster of country, mostly from Northern Europe, that are influenced by the yield curve and the sovereign risk ex proxy by the yield curve of other countries. In the post period, the cluster of country basically remain the same. So the interpretation is basically unchanged. What changes is that overall the intensity of this spillover increase, and they tend to spike around the peak of the crisis. So basically they move according to the spike of the debt crisis, and they still increase across the period of analysis. But again, the 2 cluster of countries remain unchanged. We then move to another question, which is, okay, we realize that there are countries in Europe that are that influence other yield curve, and countries in Europe that are influenced. But the question is, which is the sign? Some countries might have a positive influence on others. Some other countries might have a negative influence. So we apply the same methodology, not just on the yield curve, but modeling also the variance of the yield curve, the volatility, which is modeled with the standard time series model, which is a EGARCH, which is the one that best fits this data. And the results we found is that Germany is discarded by the algorithm due to low variability. So basically, the algorithm doesn't compute any spillover in volatility for Germany because it does not influence the volatility of other countries. So these are net volatility spillover. So basically, the interpretation in financial econometrics is that they transmit the risk, they transmit volatility as proxied by the variance in the yield curve. So Germany is influencing other countries' yield curve, but not their volatility. So we interpreted it as Germany being a country that spread not risk, but rather stability in the European Union and in the euro area. While the different interpretation is for Italy and France, which still are very significant for the volatility spillover. They are net and positive across all the period in exam. So basically, with respect to Germany, Italy and France are yields influencer, let's say, but also risk spreader. So basically, they increase volatility of other countries through this spillover. We then complement our analysis with the last results we have so far and we present here today, which is the wavelet decomposition, which, as far as we know, is the first time has been applied to yield curve because it's a common methodology in financial econometrics. which basically decompose the series at different time frequencies aimed at understanding at which of these time scale, short days, medium weeks, and long run, few months and years, happens most of the changes. So basically it is interpreted in financial econometrics as a proxy for the investor trust in the stability and solidity of a certain country. We focused on Germany and Italy because of the previous results. So we try to understand whether there are some differences from this point of view. What we believe we find, and that is shown in this graph, is that in the pre-crisis period, Germany has a higher intensity for long-run changes, which means that investor, with respect to Italy, perceives Germany more sustainable in the long time, while the frequencies and intensity in the short run is more relevant. While in the post-crisis period, things remain basically unchanged for Germany. So the perception of investor in Germany is basically unchanged, while for Italy, things start to improve. So the medium and the long run components start to become more relevant. They are still the most relevant, obviously, but they became more relevant with respect to the short one, which means we interpreted this as a sort of improving path Italy has taken in the, let's say, post-crisis period, maybe due to the season of reforms we have experienced in the last 10 years on the labor, pension market, and on the balance sheet of the balanced budget condition of the government. And it seems that the investor, due to the reason, maybe have renewed novel confidence in the sustainability of the sovereign debt of Italy in the long run. So moving to the conclusion, what we found is that spillover, both for yields and volatility, are relevant across all the period of analysis. They increase in the pre and post in the post period with respect to the pre-crisis period, and they tend to spike during the crisis. So they move according to the most troubled time. Not all the countries in Europe are similar along this dimension. Some countries influence other yield curve, and some other are influenced and do not significantly influence other countries' curves. These countries that are influenced are mostly the northern countries. So the one that hypothetically in a shared financial instruments such as the Eurobond, as also the public debate has highlighted in the last month, will have to guarantee more than they have to guarantee Italia and Southern European country debt. And for this reason, there have been several political turmoils in the European Commission. These have several policies implications. First of all, we highlighted that the public debt has a direct effect, and this has been highlighted in the literature on growth. But we highlighted that public debt of other countries have also an indirect, let's say, beneath the surface effect of affecting the yield curve and increasing volatility in among European countries, and that overall European countries are highly connected, not just in the surface, but also below the surface, as proxied by this spillover. So for all these reasons, we believe that the policymakers should take into consideration this fact when designing the next generation plan in order to stimulate growth and avoid the adverse volatility in the sovereign debt market. And finally, that if we are at the point of moving and doing some steps forward in building the common structure, the common house of the European Union, we should take into account this evidence in order to design coordinated and more than coordinated heterogeneous policies depending on country risky characteristics such as those we have just highlighted. However, I want to finish by highlighting some of the weaknesses and the step forward we want to do in the next month to improve our analysis that so far has been only exercise me and Pietro we are doing, but we hopefully in the next month will become something more. So first of all, we rely on medium-term bond from a public available open source, and we can improve the quality of the data. So we want to rely on a better proxy of a sovereign risk. So rather than the 5 years yield curve, we want to rely on the CDS, which is not public available source of data, but we have it and we want to perform the analysis again. We want to test whether our underlying hypothesis about the banking channel through which the spillover goes through is relevant. So test the previous analysis also on microdata of the bank CDS. So CDS, the proxy, the bank failure risk. And then merging another field of literature, which is a micro-macro field aimed at analyzing the effect of credit supply constraints on labor markets. So whether this is true on the linkages between spillover and banks, we would expect during the spikes of turmoil times that banks, due to the spillover, reduce the credit supply, and hence at aggregate level, firms experience credit constraints. There is also some theoretical evidence about this, and we want to test it empirically by relying on firms' data about employment or microdata about employment, especially in Italy. And finally, we will also we are also trying and we aim to link, at least trying to identify a causal link with standard econometric approach between the season of reforms and the biggest reforms Italy have experienced in the last 10 years. For example, the Article 81, which was introduced in the Constitution in 2014, correctly remember, the Fornero reform on the pension system, and the Jobs Act, which have been all relevant and relevant policies, and trying to establish a link between these reforms and the spillover trend. So whether Italy is able, by implementing structural reforms, to reduce the adverse the adverse effect is high level of debt over GDP, as also on the yield curve of other countries. And this is relevant from a policy-making point of view in order to build a better and more efficient common structure and common European houses, especially in light of the COVID pandemic. So I finished. Thanks for listening to me. Thanks for inviting us. I hope I was clear enough. Otherwise, I apologize. And I also apologize to my colleagues for being a little bit on late. So I stop the share and I leave the word. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Passerini, and your speech has been really clear. And as an old liberal, I think that you demonstrate also what we suppose. That when you raise a lot of money with debt, then you have lost your freedom. And this is with the model. With the model, you modeled also that after raising a lot of money, our European Union lost a lot of freedom to act with policies. And now we are moving on a path that is really complicated. Thank you, best compliments, and I want to if there are questions on this subject and on this paper, you can type on the chat, and I shall pass the question to Mr. Bonprezzi and Passerini. In the meantime, I want to introduce Luca Sandrini, that will present his paper on the direct and indirect effects of competition on private incentives to R&D and licensing.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Can you hear me out and loud? Okay.
Yes.
So I shall share my screen, and I hope you are able to see it properly.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you again for having me here. I'm very happy to be able to present this paper to you in this conference, and I'm honored to be selected among the winners of the Giorgio Rota Best Paper Award. In this presentation, I will try to illustrate a little bit in detail the content of my research. First of all, let me introduce myself. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Quantitative Science and Management Studies in Budapest University of Technology and Economics. My research interest falls in the applied theory, and in particular in industrial organization. So this paper is about the incentives of firms, of non-cooperating firms competing in the downstream sector in creating incentives for an upstream supplier of a technology to invest more in R&D. The correlation, the interrelation between competition and innovation is a well-known topic in economics. The origins of the debate can be tracked down from the work of Schumpeter and Kenneth Arrow, and has been developed quite widely and deeply since then. But the changes that have happened in the structural organization of production in the world has also changes the way firms and agents in these markets and in the industries interact among each other, and also therefore the incentive structures that are embedded in the market structure relationship between firms and between competing firms and supplier firms. So for this reason, this paper, which is a theoretical paper, by the way, and is meant to understand a little bit more in detail the incentive schemes coming from a competition in subsequent segment of an industry on the incentive of an innovator that stands in previous layers of the market, is aimed to somehow reproduce, although imperfectly, the verticality that has intercurred in modern production processes and organizational structures. So without further ado, let me start with a little bit of the introduction and the motivation of this study. So the main research question is quite specific, and it aims at understanding what are the direct and the indirect effect of downstream competition on upstream incentives to produce innovation and to license innovation. Now, when I talk about direct and indirect effect, I'm referring to two main concepts. First of all, as I'm analyzing how the strategic interaction among firms in layers affect the behavior of an agent in another layer of the market, we can assume that there are two kinds of effects, one that directly affect the behavior of the upstream innovator, and one that by altering the behavior of the downstream firms, indirectly also alters the behavior of the upstream firm that has to react to a change in the market structure of the downstream sector. But more more simply, I can also say that this direct and indirect effect can be interpreted as a way to disentangle the Aerobial replacement effect that has been introduced by Kenneth Arrow in his seminal paper in '62. So what is this Aerobial replacement effect? Well, I disentangle in these two components. First, there is a direct effect that is motivated by the fact that a firm operating in an environment that becomes more and more competitive has more increases willingness to pay for a technology that allows her to be more efficient, as the incentives to be an efficient firms among inefficient rivals increase in the number of inefficient rivals. So the relative gains earned by the efficient firms increasing the number of inefficient rivals. At the same time, and this is somehow included in this effect, a large innovation that comes from the fact that firms are willing to pay more as competition increases may also provide the licensee with a robust strategic advantage that is somehow the other side of a coin of a loss that is suffered by inefficient rivals. The inefficient rivals may suffer a loss which is somehow too high to be sustainable, and they risk to be excluded from the market, basically by many firms adopting a superior technology. Some firms may be excluded from the market because they are not able to produce at a sufficiently low cost when a sufficiently large number of efficient rivals are in. So this is what I refer to as an indirect effect. So basically the direct effect refers to the direct incentives to pay more for a efficient technology, and the indirect effect incorporates the incentives coming from the fact that this technology may be too large to be maybe sufficiently large for all the non-adopting firms to exit the market. And since I do not want to be among those firms that leave the market, I might be willing to pay more in order to stay in the market ultimately. So this explanation will become more clear in the afterwards of the presentation. But the main contribution of this paper to the existing literature on licensing, that is well-developed literature in the field, is that the existence of a direct and an indirect effect is proved to be robust to a licensing scheme adopted by the firms. So both in the case of a linear price scheme, so the royalty-based licensing scheme, or a fixed fee, like an upfront fee, a license fee, a licensing scheme, it is possible to prove that those two effects are existing, operating, and influencing the upstream innovator in producing and developing a more efficient technology. I will skip, for sake of saving time, the literature review, and I will be back on later if you want to discuss it properly. Now, let me just describe a little bit the model, and then I will go fast into the results of the paper. The model is the simplest I could think about. There are two segments of an industry. So there is a vertical structure with two segments of an industry. The downstream sector is the sector where the final good is produced by n competing firms with a linear demand function. And those firms that has to adopt a technology to produce the good, and the technology is either a default one or it's a technology produced by an upstream innovator. For sake of simplicity, let's assume that the upstream innovator, which is a monopolist because it owns a patent for this technology, and therefore it has to invest in design and development cost. But the idea of having a monopolist upstream and a competitive or oligopolistic sector downstream is a way to capture both the Aerobian replacement effect in the downstream sector, adopting firms competing in order to be more efficient, and a Schumpeterian effect coming from the fact that the one that invests in technology is actually a monopolist due to the fact that it has some intellectual property rights, or because it's a monopolist in the market. Now, as I mentioned, there is a choice of technology for the downstream firms that has to produce the final good, and they can do it by adopting a default option, which is the strategy B, simpler linear cost and constant cost function, or and it's freely available in the market. They can go for the efficient technology, the one that is patented by the innovator, and which allows to produce at reduced cost, C minus X, X being the cost reducing effect, therefore the size of the innovation, or somehow reflects also the incentives to invest in innovation. So the larger X, the larger the incentives to invest in innovation ultimately. But it's not free, it's obviously costly. It must be paid, the innovator wants to be paid for the technology, and the payment may happen either with a royalty rate that affects the marginal cost of production, or with a fixed fee. And I assume there is no combination among the two. So I want to analyze the extreme of the classes of licensing scheme. So the full per linear price unit, royalties, or the surplus extraction, so fixed fee. As a tie-breaking rule, I assume that if the two rows are equal, there is a preference for innovation. This is not really an important technology, an important assumption. It's just a matter of tie-breaking solution. All the results hold, even if the price of the technology is 1 epsilon inferior to the other one. The technology is developed by an innovator, and the cost of the technology is quadratic in the size of the benefit of the technology. So the higher the cost reducing effect, the higher the investments that must be required. And the gamma is a parameter that adjusts the convexity of this function, and somehow can be related to the inverse of the efficiency of the innovator. So the larger the gamma, the lower the efficiency of the innovator, meaning that for a given size of innovation, an innovator that has a gamma that is very high is unable to produce the same size of innovation of someone who has a gamma very low. Yes, finally, M refers to the number of adopters of the technology, and of course, the profits of the upstream innovator depends on the licensing scheme. With royalties, it depends on the output production of the downstream sector, the output production made by the adopters of the technology. Otherwise, it's just a collection of the fees, obviously in both cases minus the investing cost. Since it's a process innovation, well, it's a process innovation for the downstream sector. It can be intended as a product innovation for the upstream innovator, but for sake of simplicity, let's reduce it as a process innovation for the downstream sector. There might be the case that the innovation has some drastic effect on the market. Here I borrow the definition by Sen 2007, by a famous paper by Sen 2007. Let's say that a K-drastic innovation is defined as an innovation for which K is the minimum number, such that if K firms adopt the innovation, the other ones has to leave the market because they are no longer able to compete in that market. Okay, and the timing of the game is solved by backward induction. It has 3 stages of the game: so choice of the contract and investments, choice of the price of the technology, and finally competition in the downstream sector. Okay, so this is the model. I hope I hope I've been clear about all the components or the agents of the model. and let me just go for the results. I will focus only on the results for royalty rate because they are the most interesting for my purpose here. But all the results replicate also for the licensing fees, and I will show you that is the case. But I will not give you all the details for the licensing scheme case. So I will give you the results in terms of non-drastic and K-drastic innovation. Non-drastic innovations is, I'm going to be very quick. It's an exercise that replicates the result of the literature. There is no really something very novel here. We have a monopolist innovator that has to set a price for a linear price for a new product. There is a participation constraint because the cost of innovation cannot exceed the benefit of innovation. Otherwise, no one will to adopt the innovation in the end. And this participation constraint is binding because profit maximizing price would be higher than the benefit of innovation. And therefore, we have a equilibrium price that is somehow the same as the benefit of the innovation. And this result implies that the innovator wants every firm to acquire the technology, which is consistent with the literature. So royalty rate somehow awards quantities over quality, and as you prefer to give to all the firms your technology, you also want competition to be very large, because the larger the competition, the larger the output, and the larger the output, the larger the revenues from innovation, from licensing in the end. And this can be embedded in an analysis of how competition measured as the number of competing firms in the downstream sector affect the size of innovation in equilibrium. Now, taking a step backward, as I mentioned before, an innovation in process might be K-drastic. A K-drasticity condition implies that there is a strategic advantage and there is a strategic disadvantage, so a loss that is suffered by inefficient firms. Of course, if all the firms adopt the technology and if the price of the technology is equal to the benefit of the technology is turned out to be neutral in the end, because the cost function would be a C plus X minus X, just to give you a mathematical vision of this. So the true technology, obsolete and efficient one, would be actually the same in terms of cost. Now, let's assume for a second that the innovator set a price which is below X. So we are still in the domain of the participation constraint because B is between 0 and 1. But now the price is a little bit lower than X. So beta is lower than 1, and therefore this is lower than X. Now, in this case, we have some marginal advantage for eventual adopters, because now the benefits of innovation outweigh the cost of innovation. And if the number of firms adopting the innovation is smaller than N, we also have a strategic disadvantage, because some firms turn out to be inefficient. And if few firms are inefficient in a market dominated by efficient firms, the loss might actually satisfy the condition for K-elasticity. And in particular, we have that if condition C1 is satisfied, the innovation may exert a K-drastic effect in the market. That means this is basically if we rewrite this as A minus C minus X times M 1 over B, this is the strategic loss of the inefficient firms. And if this inequality hold, it means that in equilibrium, the quantity of the inefficient firms cannot be positive. Now, the innovator has to make a choice in this situation, and the choice is either to go business as usual, so provide all the firms with the technology at a larger price possible, so the same situation as before, or to give the innovation just to M firms in order to trigger the K-drastic effect, but at a lower price. In this case, we will have M oligopoly emerging, because N minus M firms will leave the market, and therefore we have a restructuring of the market, basically a shakeout of the industry. And interestingly enough, the first row is actually larger than the second one if this condition holds. And again, interestingly enough, there is a range of beta, which is consistent with between 0 and 1. So beta star is actually lower than 1, for which this condition is subsumed in condition 1. So there is a set of beta and a price that is, or a parameter that adjusts the price, a discount the factor, that allows rationing of licensing to be more efficient in terms of, more profitable for the innovator in terms of profits. And if we compute the equilibrium price of the innovation, we see that competition disappears from the calculation. So the size of innovation and the number of firms in equilibrium are not affected anymore by the competition in the downstream sector. However, the condition for this size of innovation to be complying with the condition that we pose, so for condition 1 to be satisfied, depends on the competitive pressure in the market. And this somehow can be summarized in two main results that are two of the main results of this paper. The first one is that, counterintuitively enough, although logically, if you look in perspective, is that the innovator may, under some condition, the innovator may be willing to sell the innovation to fewer firms at a discounted price in order to increase their profits. And this is because when these conditions, these criteria are met, the innovator can trigger the competitive advantage of the firms, can lower the price, increase the benefit of the innovation. The benefit of innovation increased means that the output per firms increase. And if inefficient firms are pushed out of the market, then the new market, which is more concentrated, but populated by more efficient firms, may actually outcompensate the loss of the diseconomies from a more concentrated market. So basically, the efficient reallocation of production might more than compensate the diseconomies coming from a more concentrated market, which is consistent and is somehow market-driven result of the famous paper by Lahiri and Ono that stated such a planner may actually want to kick out inefficient firms from the market. This is somehow the same things, but operating by an upstream innovator. And the second proposition is that we have a direct and an indirect effect. The direct effect operates only in the non-drastic situation and increase the size of the technology increase. But we have also an indirect effect that operates in the drastic innovation scenario. That is somehow the fact that this threshold moves on the right as an increase. Meaning that innovators that were once able to produce a non-drastic innovation as an increase might become able to produce a K-drastic innovation. And this indirect effect is incorporated in the incentives to invest in innovation by the innovator. Now, I want to wrap up to the conclusion because I know I'm short of time. Let me just show you the same results for the licensing fee structure. This is the same picture for licensing fees. We have an additional area which is canonic in the licensing fees literature. There might be a situation where we have non-drasticity and partial adoption. But again, the interesting part is that as an increase, the size of innovation increase mainly on the right side end of the distribution of gammas, and the thresholds move on the right. And this means that an innovator that was able once to produce a non-drastic innovation, as competition increase, might be able to produce a K-drastic innovation in the end. Again, a direct effect, which directly increase the size of innovation, and an indirect effect that is somehow identified by the sensitivity of the market of large innovations. So the more competitive the market, the more fragile is the market when it comes a new technology of production. And this is somehow synthesized by the Aerobial drastic effect. The arrow drasticity means that one firm's in perfect competition invest in process, lower its price, then it costs them more than the competitors, and therefore leapfrog all the rivals and becomes a natural monopoly. K-drasticity is somehow more flexible because it allows K-oligopoly instead of monopolies, but it basically reflects the same situation. And in this case, those effects are embedded in the incentives to invest in innovation by the innovator firms that has to choose how much to invest. Yeah, I have no time to discuss a little bit the welfare. I already mentioned something about the misallocation of production and the economies from a more efficient allocation. I would like to conclude for this presentation enough. So again, there is the conclusion of this research so far as that is that there is a direct and an indirect effect that can be measured, that can be incorporated in the incentives of an upstream innovator to invest in innovation. And we may have a situation where rationing of licenses is possible also under linear per unit price, which is actually a contribution to the literature, because to my knowledge, it's the first one that identified this rationing of licensing in a linear per unit price with a single input production function model. The only exception is Lapan and Moschini, but they work with multi-input production functions. So the price of other factors drive this result. So this concludes my presentation for today. Thank you very much, and apologies if I took some minutes more than allotted.
Thank you for your speech. We are a bit late in our scheduling, but your paper are really interesting, and so I hope also the other attendant will be with us for the following presentation. And I have scheduled now Martina Ronica and Caterina Shortino and Pietro Pizzuto with a paper on COVID-19 and tourism. And after their presentation, I have in schedule Francesca Rota, that is that have some question for you before our concluding remarks. So thank you, Luca Sandrini, and I invite Ronica, Shortino, and Pizzuto to take to start their presentation.
Okay, so thank you. Good evening to everyone. I'm Martina Ronica from the University of Palermo. And first of all, I would like to thank also on behalf of my co-authors, Pietro Pizzuto and Caterina Shortino, the Centro Einaudi for giving us this opportunity. As everybody knows, COVID-19 has caused one of the deepest economic crises since the Great Depression. The rapid transmission of the virus and the high number of asymptomatic people induced governments to shut down the activity in many sectors and impose travel and mobility restrictions. Thus, tourism has been one of the most affected sectors. In this respect, current data referring to 2020 already shows that tourist arrival fell sharply, with a decline between 69% and 84% being recorded for the whole year with respect to 2019 level. Even worse is the scenario prospected by the International Air Transport Association, which suggests that a full recovery of the sector will take place not before 2023-2024. Clearly, the future scenario will depend on the current development of the pandemic. Since the coronavirus outbreak, some studies have focused on analyzing the short-term impact of COVID-19 and forecasting the future economic panorama, while some other studies instead try to infer its possible medium-term consequences by analyzing the economic effects of past pandemic events. For instance, Giorgio 2020 and Barro 2020 do that looking at GDP. Since there is an high uncertainty on this pandemic medium and long-run implication, the study of past events could be a useful guide to understand how the current pandemic could end up. This is not the first time that tourism experienced such a crisis. Indeed, it has experienced both past pandemic and epidemic episodes, but also natural disasters. And the literature on both these two kinds of events already shown their shrinking effect on tourism flows, especially in the affected areas. However, this literature has mainly adopted a case study approach, with few studies discussing and comparing in a unique framework the effect of different pandemic and epidemic episodes. Moreover, the focus on a single pair country event has limited use to explain not only the economic but also the social consequences of this kind of events. Thus, our research contributes to the existing literature, investigating in a unique framework several pandemic and epidemic episodes and a large panel of countries with different degree of development. Indeed, notwithstanding the uniqueness of COVID-19, a lot can be learned from the past. And in particular, we could try to infer how the current pandemic could end up, and moreover, whether its effect will persist in the medium term. To this end, the analysis focuses on the impact of the most important pandemic and epidemic episodes of the last 2 decades, in particular SARS, MERS, H1N1, Ebola, and Zika. Then, in line with Ma et al. And Furceri et al. 2020, we define our main independent variable of interest, that is a dummy, assuming value equal to 1 when the WHO declares a pandemic for the country and 0 otherwise, while data on our dependent variable, that is on the number of tourist arrivals, are retrieved from the World Development Indicator database. Thus, we finally end up with an unbalanced panel of 183 countries for the period 1995-2018. The most widespread and also deadly pandemic in our sample is H1N1, while the other epidemic episodes were mostly confined to specific areas, in particular SARS and MERS in Asia, Ebola in Africa, and Zika in the Americas. To examine the effect of pandemics on tourist arrival, we follow Giorgio 2005 and estimate impulse response function based on the local projection of the effects of pandemics on tourist arrivals. So as reported in equation 1, we regress the change in tourist arrival for country I in year T on both country and time fixer effect, on our main variable of interest, that is the dummy indicating the pandemic shock, and on a set of control X, which in this baseline version includes 2 legs of the dependent variable and 2 legs of the pandemic shocks. This equation is estimated for each future time horizon, and then impulse response are retrieved from the sequence of coefficients beta k. Figure 1 shows our baseline results, that is that major epidemic and pandemic of the last 2 decades led to a long-lasting decrease in tourist arrivals, with a peak of 12.5% 3 years after the outbreak of the pandemic shock. These results are robust to the use of alternative methodologies, such as, for example, the autoregressive distributed lag model, as in Romer, which is shown in panel A, and to the inclusion of additional controls, such as the level of economic development, population density, or trade openness. Then we account for the fact that pandemics may be heterogeneous both across countries and across episodes. So we first group countries according to the World Bank classification in advanced economies, emerging market economies, and low income and developing countries, and re-estimate equation 1 for each of these groups. We show that emerging market economies and low income and developing countries experience a larger reduction in tourist arrival of approximately 12 and 28% 4 years after the outbreak of the pandemic shock. This may be due to the fact that this country very often lack adequate instruments to offset such crises, and very often also rely more on tourism than advanced economies. In addition, the heterogeneity across country groups could also be explained by different health system performance. Indeed, less developed economies tend to have worse performance in the health system than the advanced one. To this end, we use the Health Efficiency Index by the WHO, which assumes value between 0 and 1. And in particular, we use this index to split our sample of countries in countries with high health system performance and low health system performance according to the average value of the index. But the results were robust also splitting the sample according to the median value. These results are reported in figure 4, which shows that countries with high health system performance suffer less from pandemic and epidemic episodes in terms of tourist arrivals than countries with low health system performance that instead experience a fall of 27% 3 years after the outbreak of the pandemic event. These results were also robust to the use of an alternative index that is the Global Health Security Index by the Johns Hopkins University, which instead ranges between 0 and 100. Moreover, we account for the fact that pandemics may be heterogeneous across episodes. And in particular, given that H1N1 is the most widespread and deadly in our sample, thus it is likely to be the most similar to COVID-19 in terms of diffusion and severity, even if clearly much smaller in scale. We decide to compare the effects of this pandemic vis-a-vis to those generated by the other epidemic episodes in our sample. These results are shown in figure 5, which shows that we have a larger decline in tourist arrival of about 20% in the case of H1N1, while in the case of the other pandemic, the negative effect was lower and approximately -8%. Finally, we account for the role of severity and uncertainty that may be relevant in shaping the impact of these episodes on tourist arrivals. We account for severity using the ratio of confirmed cases to total population, while to examine the role of uncertainty, we use the World Pandemic Uncertainty Index, that is a sub-index of the World Uncertainty Index developed by Hahir et al., that essentially counts the number of times in which the word uncertainty is used together with the word pandemic in the Economist Intelligence Unit country report. Clearly, the higher is the number, the higher is the uncertainty associated with the pandemic episodes. To this end, we extend our baseline specification, allowing the average response of tourist arrivals to vary according to such country-specific characteristics. And we estimate equation 2, that is a regime switching model based on a logistic distribution function that essentially controls from the transition from one regime, that is the one with low severity uncertainty, to another that is the one with high severity and uncertainty, according to the smooth transition function f, which can be interpreted as the probability of having a given level of severity or uncertainty. The main coefficients of interest in this case are beta KL and beta KH, which refers respectively to the case of low and high severity uncertainty. So figure 6 reports the results for the role of severity, which highlights that there is a much stronger decline in tourist arrivals for countries with a high number of reported cases as a share of the total population, while the effect is lower in the case of low severity. Similar results are found in the case of uncertainty. In particular, we find in the short term a striking difference between the case of high and low uncertainty that is about 80 percentage points that last until the first 2 years after the pandemic outbreak, while it tends to attenuate at a later stage, even if remaining above the 7%. Concluding, major pandemic and epidemic episodes of the last 2 decades led to a persistent decline in tourist arrival, with the effects being larger for less developed and developing economies. These effects, however, are heterogeneous and depend on several conditions, such as, for example, the overall performance of the health system, the uncertainty or the severity associated to the shock. How these results relate to COVID-19? Well, COVID-19 is characterized by high uncertainty and high severity. Thus, looking at these results, we could reasonably expect long-lasting negative consequences on tourism. Finally, in terms of policy implication, on the demand side, higher fall in tourism in the case of higher uncertainty and lower health system performance advocate policy makers to undertake measures aimed at improving such dimension. For instance, tourism authorities should continue to require the observation of minimum safety protocols in restaurants and in general in all the activities related to tourism and hospitality. In addition, the fact that countries with better health systems tend to be less severely affected by the crisis highlights the crucial role for public health services and also nowadays the crucial role of vaccination campaigns. Thus, the sooner the countries will be able to complete these vaccination campaigns, the faster will be the recovery of tourism sector. On the supply side, instead, there is the need to continue to sustain tourism companies with low interest loans and transfer to support people employed in this sector, especially temporary workers, which are the most affected by the crisis. Since every crisis also brings new opportunities, the shift in tourists' preferences toward a less crowded destination may foster novel form and more sustainable form of tourism. Finally, there's the need to make countries less tourism dependent in order to prevent the harmful effects of possible future health crises. So increase the ability of these countries to recover and increase their resilience. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to thank a lot for your presentation, even if from your chart it appears that our tourism will not recover before 2024 or 2025, but we have the hope that the next generation EU will accelerate this return to the normality, but your estimates and the method you applied to this subject, to this investigation, I appreciate a lot. And so before having our virtual prize ceremony, I want to ask if there are some questions for somebody of you, and I have scheduled an intervention by Francesca Silvia Rota. Francesca, if you want to do your intervention.
Yes, thank you very much for these very interesting researches. I have a question for Filippo Passarini. Thank you for this interesting analysis, because it shows with data and graphs a pretty common idea about the influence some European countries, and unfortunately Italy, exert on the volatility of other countries and other national markets. So I really appreciated it. In the following steps, I would suggest to focus, for instance, on the explanation of the differences between the two periods you considered in your analysis, the period 2000, 2009 and 2009, 2020, 2020. This, I think, could be quite interesting, especially trying to understand if changes occurred in that international banking channels you mentioned as one of the main reasons explaining these spillovers that occur. So thank you. And just a question, when in the very last slide you say that policymakers should work to make the next generation EU a good tool to avoid to reduce the adverse volatility. I am wondering the type of policymakers you have in your mind. I mean, European policymakers or our national policymakers, but it is just a question I have. So thank you.
Well, thanks for the suggestion and for the appreciation of the paper. I'll try to answer really briefly. So yeah, in the European Commission and European Parliament, I believe that policymakers already knew this thing. When I said about policymaker, I believe that this thing should be acknowledged by Italian policymaker, which seems to sluggish behind the European one about the problem that Italy has become in the past decades, for its low sustainability of the public debt in Europe. So I believe there should be a sort of acknowledgement by Italian policymaker that Italy, for its systemic relevance and for the relevance of its economy, should consider to implement some structural reforms in order to, let's say, compensate what we highlighted in our results. So the fact that basically we are a risk spreader in all the European countries. And if the bank hypothesis underlining our results might be further validated by a deeper analysis of bank CDS, I believe that Italian policymakers should finally address one of the biggest problems in Italy, which is the sustainability of the banking system. And banking models still really common in Italy that have caused many trouble, and that have been also widely discussed in the Italian public opinion for the bankruptcy of many institutes. And what we might have highlighted is that these have consequences, also relevant consequences, also for other countries. So basically, we should consider that we are not alone, and these bankruptcy have consequences also on other countries' debt sustainability.
Thank you. If I excuse me, if I have time, I would like also to make two more questions to the other two panelists, if I have a time.
Yeah.
Okay, to Luca Sandrini. I am not an expert at all in your topic, but I would like to ask you if your analysis apply to all types of innovations and then to all types of IPR, innovation property rights, so licenses, etc., or not, because I have in mind the big issue of licenses in the patents of the vaccines, and of course the question is about the applicability of this kind of analysis to this type to this specific type of patents too.
Thank you very much for the question. It's a very good topic. I have to be honest, the origin of this paper has been precedent of the pandemic, so I wasn't thinking about it when I start working on it. But indeed, this is a good question, because as I mentioned, the verticality of the structure of the model allows to somehow proxy the results to a situation where you have a supply chain or a global or local, depending on how you focus. And as we know from the literature on those who look at global supply chain and global value chains, we know that we have a situation where as property rights reinforce on the upstream sector, and this might be reflected in the monopoly in my model, and competitions affect the downstream sector as globalization kicks in, we have a distribution of the value added that is more skewed toward the R&D intensive sector. So we have extraction of value added from the innovator at the expenses or the expenditure of manufacturing firms, which is actually a result that I replicate in the model. So somehow, and this is somehow also can be transferred also to a model of product innovation. Of course, with some caveat, this model treats competition as the number of active firms producing the same good. Okay. As we introduce product innovation, competition should be how close are the new products to the former one. And maybe the number of firms stops counting that much. But it's an interesting question, and this is indeed a direction that I am taking in these days. So thank you very much.
Thank you to you. And finally, to Martina Aronica. I agree with Beppe Russo. I really appreciated this idea of comparing previous pandemics, epidemics, because we did have previous pandemics and epidemics, but my impression is that the debate about the problems related with these big crisis connected with the health crisis remain somehow circumscribed in the areas that were affected by the pandemics and epidemics. Instead, it was very nice to have this comparative study. Well, not comparative study, but comparing data from previous events and this big event that occurred to us. So I just wanted to appreciate your work. Very, very nice.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Silvia. We are at the end of our ceremony. I would like, in name of Centro Einaudi and the Fondazione CRT, to congratulate all the authors of these winning papers. And today we had some examples of how economics can be studied in order to obtain results that are applicable to the policies. And this would have pleased by Giorgio Rota, who was a professor of economic policy and highly regarded the real application of his research. I would also like to say all you that the prizes will be paid by the Centro Einaudi administration that has been probably just in touch with all of you. And we are really sorry that due to the pandemic, also this year, for the second year, we cannot do this ceremony in person. So we hope that in the near future we can recover, and we can invite you in one of our next events, maybe with other subject, but I hope that by the end of 2021 or by the start or in the start of 2022, we can recover and also restart with our events calendar in presence. Finally, I would like to remind you, and also to all the attendants to this ceremony, that these 3 papers will be collected in a book that we will publish on the internet, but also on paper. And thanks to the grant that this project has from the Fondazione Cassa di Risparmio di Torino, which is the sponsor of this prize from his start. Thank a lot to all of you. Thank to Francesca Rota, that was also in the panel that judged the papers. And we hope you will have a great career in your studies. Really, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
It was a pleasure for us. Hi to everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.